Inspector Purbright arrived in Marehurst at 11 minutes past 10, which was later than he preferred, and earlier than the town would have liked. The train deposited him with minimal ceremony, and the stationmaster, having confirmed his identity twice with apologetic thoroughness, directed him toward the close as if pointing out a historical inconvenience. Marehurst was the sort of place that described itself as unchanged, a claim usually made by those who had done the changing some time ago and were now satisfied with the results. The death of Sister Agnes had occurred 3 weeks earlier and had been classified, with gentle firmness, as natural. The letter from the diocesan secretary, however, suggested that the classification had required discussion. It was a letter of admirable restraint, containing no accusation and very little information, but expressing a wish that certain matters of context might be clarified before they acquired an undesirable independence. Purbright had read it twice, appreciating its tone without entirely trusting it. He walked toward the cathedral along streets that displayed prosperity modestly, like a virtue that had once been necessary and was now merely habitual. Notices for parish events occupied most windows, jumble sales, a choral recital postponed owing to circumstances, and a lecture on local history that promised reassurance rather than discovery. Purbright observed these things without comment, though he made a mental note of the postponement. Circumstances, he had learned, were rarely neutral. The cathedral itself received him with a cool tolerance. Canon Berridge, a man whose manners suggested long practice in discouraging questions while appearing to invite them, greeted him in the south porch. Their exchange of pleasantries was precise and brief, as though both understood that anything more expansive might be misinterpreted. "We are grateful you were able to come, Inspector," the canon said. "Entirely as a precaution, of course." "Of course," Purbright replied, which allowed the statement to remain unexamined. They walked slowly toward the choir, Berridge explaining the layout with unnecessary detail. The inspector listened attentively, noting how often the explanation circled back to order, continuity, and the absence of disruption. Sister Agnes's name was not mentioned until Purbright introduced it himself, and even then it was treated with care, like a word that might stain the tongue if handled improperly. She was much respected, the canon said. Very quiet, efficient, not inclined to cause difficulty. Purbright paused beside the choir stalls, their wood polished to a muted shine. "And yet she has," he said mildly, "caused sufficient difficulty to warrant my presence." Berridge smiled in a way that suggested agreement without concession. Only indirectly. The choir book lay open on its stand, a large and dignified object, its pages heavy with tradition. Purbright did not touch it immediately. He observed instead the arrangement of the stalls, the careful symmetry, the absence of personal effects. It was a place designed to erase individuality in the service of harmony, a quality much admired in Marehurst. "There was a message," Purbright said at last. Berridge inclined his head. "So we understand. Written beneath the book? So we are told. And now missing?" The canon hesitated, a fraction too long. "Misplaced," he said finally. "After the interest it generated, it seemed prudent to secure it." Purbright accepted this without comment. He bent slightly, examining the stand. There was nothing visible, no indentation, no obvious mark. If something had been there, it had been removed with care. He straightened and brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve, an unnecessary gesture that allowed silence to settle. "The parish newsletter," he said, "described Sister Agnes as exemplary." "Yes, that is not unusual. No, it is sometimes," Purbright continued. "An indication that the deceased has been discussed rather more vigorously than the description implies." Berridge laughed softly, the sound of a man who enjoyed wit provided it remained abstract. "You are very experienced, Inspector." "Experience," Purbright said, "consists largely of noticing when people are anxious to agree." They moved to the vestry, where tea had been prepared in anticipation of the inspector's arrival. The cups were thin and expensive, and the tea tasted of compliance. 2 other canons joined them, both men of similar age and expression, differing only in the intensity with which they sought to be reassuring. Conversation circled politely around the weather, the choir, and the inconvenience of recent repairs. Sister Agnes's death entered the discussion only as a logistical matter. Her room required clearing. Her duties had been redistributed. She handled correspondence, one of the canons said. A task she performed admirably. "Correspondence invites interpretation," Purbright observed. "Yes," the canon agreed quickly. And she was very discreet. Purbright smiled. Discretion, he said, is often praised after the fact. There was a pause, during which cups were lifted and replaced. The men watched him carefully, as though unsure whether he had made a point or merely a remark. Purbright allowed the ambiguity to remain. He asked about the message again, this time more specifically, its length, its tone, its purpose. The answers were vague but consistent, which he found less reassuring than inconsistency. It was not intended for general circulation, Berridge said. Few messages are, Purbright replied. That does not prevent them from being read. When the interview concluded, he was escorted back into the nave. The cathedral was empty now, the earlier sense of welcome replaced by a quiet expectancy. Purbright stood for a moment beneath the crossing, listening to the building breathe. He imagined Sister Agnes here, unnoticed, precise, correcting something small and necessary. As he turned to leave, he noticed a novice at the far end of the aisle, arranging hymnals with excessive care. She glanced up, met his eye, and then looked away too quickly. When he passed her, she murmured a greeting that faltered midway, as though she had reconsidered its appropriateness. Purbright nodded and continued on, but he registered the hesitation. It was minor, almost nothing, yet it carried with it the faint suggestion of instruction. Outside, the bells began to practice for Sunday, each note placed carefully, no discord permitted. He walked back toward the close with the measured satisfaction of a man who had learned very little and therefore suspected much. Whatever Sister Agnes had written, it had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. That, he thought, was precisely the problem. Inspector Purbright spent the morning in the company of people who regarded courtesy as a form of fortification. Mayor Hurst, having received him without enthusiasm, now attempted to absorb him into its routines as though predictability might blunt inquiry. He walked first to the convent adjoining the close, a building whose modesty had been carefully maintained and recently refurbished. The gate was opened by Sister Imelda, whose smile appeared to have been approved by committee. She led him to a small parlor furnished with chairs that discouraged relaxation. Tea arrived promptly, accompanied by an apology for its weakness, which Purbright suspected was untrue. Sister Imelda sat opposite him with her hands folded, prepared to answer questions that had already been rehearsed internally. Sister Agnes was with us for 19 years, she said before he had asked. A woman of discipline and consistency. Consistency, Purbright replied, is sometimes mistaken for agreement. She acknowledged this with a nod that did not concede the point. Her manner suggested a preference for generalities, and she supplied them with efficiency. Sister Agnes rose early, worked late, and showed no inclination toward complaint. She kept records, managed letters, and corrected errors when they arose. The corrections, Sister Imelda emphasized, were always polite. Politeness, Purbright said gently, is a flexible instrument. Sister Imelda smiled, though the smile lingered a moment too long. She was not always popular, she admitted. Accuracy can appear critical to those who benefit from approximation. Purbright asked about the choir book, and the message said to have been hidden beneath it. Sister Imelda's expression altered slightly, as though she had reached the edge of her prepared remarks. It was a note, she said. Brief, unfinished perhaps. Unfinished in what sense? In that it was never meant to be delivered. Sister Agnes wrote things down. It helped her think. And what did it say? Sister Imelda paused. I did not read it. Did anyone? Possibly. Purbright accepted the ambiguity. He had learned that certainty, when offered too readily, was rarely reliable. He thanked her for her time and rose. As he did so, he noticed a small stack of envelopes on a side table, each addressed in Sister Agnes's hand. None bore a return address. From the convent he walked the parish office, where the editor of the parish newsletter presided over a desk arranged with obsessive clarity. Mrs. Talbot was a woman who believed deeply in balance, provided it was achieved quietly. She greeted Purbright with enthusiasm tempered by caution. We aim to reflect the community, she said, offering him a chair, not to provoke it. Purbright leafed through recent issues of the newsletter, noting the careful distribution of praise and the absence of dissent. Obituaries were uniformly gracious, announcements uniformly optimistic. He asked about a correction published 2 months earlier, a minor amendment regarding a donation. Oh yes, Mrs. Talbot said quickly. A simple mistake, corrected promptly. At Sister Agnes's suggestion, Mrs. Talbot hesitated, then nodded. She was very attentive. She noticed things others missed. Did she miss anything herself? Mrs. Talbot smiled thinly. If she did not mention it. Purbright asked whether Sister Agnes had ever expressed concern about how information was presented. Mrs. Talbot adjusted a stack of papers before replying. She believed accuracy was a form of respect, she said. Not everyone agrees. And how did disagreements conclude? With understanding, Mrs. Talbot said. Eventually, when Purbright left the office, he walked toward the parish hall where a committee meeting was in progress. He did not attend, but he stood briefly in the corridor, listening to the muffled cadence of voices. The words were indistinct, but the rhythm was familiar, reassurance punctuated by polite laughter. In the afternoon he visited the churchwarden, Mr. Ellis, a man whose geniality suggested long practice in smoothing edges. They spoke at length about the choir, its recent difficulties, and the importance of maintaining morale. Mr. Ellis described a postponed recital, attributing it to scheduling conflicts. Conflicts, Purbright repeated. Entirely logistical, Mr. Ellis said. Nothing personal. Purbright glanced at a notice board behind him, where a handwritten note announced the postponement owing to circumstances. The handwriting was not Sister Agnes's. Circumstances, Purbright said, are often personal to someone. Mr. Ellis laughed, relieved by what he assumed was a joke. He offered Purbright a tour of the vestry, pointing out recent improvements. The choir book had been returned to its place, though Mr. Ellis touched it with unnecessary care. It's important to keep things as they were, he said. Purbright nodded. As they were, he repeated, wondering which version that referred to. As he left the church, he encountered the same novice he had noticed the previous day. She was carrying hymnals, her expression carefully neutral. This time she did not hesitate in her greeting, though her eyes lingered briefly on his face. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she said. "Good afternoon," Purbright replied. "You have been busy." "Yes," she said. "There has been some rearrangement." He watched her walk away, noting the tension in her shoulders. It was slight, but it suggested instruction rather than inclination. Purbright stood for a moment in the fading light, considering the day's conversations. No one had lied to him, he thought. They had merely agreed, collectively, to omit something. He turned back toward his lodgings with the quiet certainty that Sister Agnes's note had not been unfinished at all. It had simply reached a conclusion that the town preferred not to read. Inspector Purbright attended evensong not from piety but from habit, having learned that communities revealed themselves most clearly when engaged in collective reassurance. The service at Merehurst Cathedral was conducted with practiced calm. The choir sang with precision and restraint, each voice maintaining its allotted space. Harmony, Purbright observed, was achieved not through enthusiasm but through mutual restraint, a principle that extended well beyond music. He took a seat toward the back, where he could observe without being observed. The congregation was sparse but attentive, composed largely of those whose presence was habitual rather than devout. Heads inclined at appropriate moments, hands folded with moderate conviction. During the exchange of hymnals, several parishioners avoided one another's eyes with studied success. After the service, the verger approached him with a deference that suggested both recognition and mild alarm. Mr. Henshaw was a man who believed deeply in order, and believed even more deeply in its fragility. "Everything satisfactory, Inspector?" he asked. "Entirely," Purbright replied. "I find evensong clarifying." Mr. Henshaw smiled, uncertain whether this was praise or warning. He spoke at some length about the choir's discipline, the importance of routine, and the regrettable disruption caused by recent speculation. "Speculation," Purbright said, "tends to follow silence." "Yes," Mr. Henshaw agreed quickly, "which is why we are keen to prevent it." They walked together toward the vestry, where a small group had gathered under the pretext of tidying. Their conversation faltered slightly at Purbright's arrival, then resumed with exaggerated normality. Someone mentioned the weather, someone else agreed. Purbright noticed an envelope resting on a side table, partially concealed beneath a service sheet. It was unsealed and addressed simply to the wardens, in Sister Agnes's precise hand. "May I?" he asked. Mr. Henshaw hesitated, then nodded. The envelope was empty. "That is unfortunate," Purbright said mildly. "It was found like that," Mr. Henshaw replied. "Possibly misfiled." "Possibly," Purbright said, returning it to the table. "Oh, possibly delivered." Mr. Henshaw did not respond. He busied himself aligning hymn books that were already straight. Later, in the cloister, Purbright spoke with Mrs. Penfold, a churchwarden, whose manner combined efficiency with a talent for omission. She explained the recent parish council meeting with admirable fluency, emphasizing consensus and the absence of dissent. There was some discussion, she said, about the wording of certain acknowledgements. Donations? Purbright asked. Legacies, Mrs. Penfold corrected gently. A sensitive area. Sensitivity, Purbright said, is often a matter of emphasis. Mrs. Penfold smiled, relieved by what she assumed was sympathy. She explained that Sister Agnes had been meticulous in her record-keeping, occasionally to the discomfort of others. She believed names mattered, Mrs. Penfold said. Not everyone shared that view, and how was the matter resolved? With agreement, Mrs. Penfold said. Eventually, Purbright walked alone through the close afterward, noting the careful maintenance of lawns and the absence of children. The town appeared settled, as though nothing of consequence had occurred. He paused by a notice board where a typed announcement explained the postponement of the choral recital. Beneath it, a handwritten edition offered apologies for any inconvenience. The handwriting was unfamiliar. In the late afternoon he visited the retired organist, Mr. Caldwell, who lived in a small house overlooking the river. Caldwell received him cordially but suggested a walk rather than sitting indoors. The river moved slowly, as if considering its obligations. Sister Agnes, Caldwell said, had a good ear. For music? For truth, Caldwell replied. She disliked embellishment. He described a disagreement over a memorial plaque where the wording had implied a generosity exceeding the facts. Sister Agnes, he said. Ad objected quietly and in writing. She believed the correction would be welcomed, Caldwell said. It was not. What happened? Purbright asked. The wording was amended, Caldwell said. Temporarily, they stopped by the water. Caldwell looked at the current with faint disapproval. Do you know what she wrote beneath the choir book? Purbright asked. Caldwell shook his head. Only that it was accurate. As Purbright returned toward the cathedral, evening settling with polite inevitability, he passed the novice again. She stood near the entrance, hesitating as though uncertain whether to speak. Inspector, she said at last. If something is written down, does it matter where? Purbright considered the question. It matters, he said. Who wishes it not to be read? She nodded, satisfied or perhaps merely resigned, and turned away. Purbright watched her go, reflecting that the town had invested considerable effort in preserving harmony. The cost, he suspected, was being paid quietly, in pencil, beneath a book no one wished to examine too closely. Inspector Purbright spent the morning with paper. Merehurst, having exhausted its capacity for conversation, now relied upon documentation to maintain its composure. Letters, minutes, drafts, and memoranda were produced for his benefit with a confidence that suggested nothing of consequence could survive transcription. Purbright read slowly, aware that what was omitted often possessed greater coherence than what remained. At the parish office he was given access to council minutes from the past year. They were models of moderation. Decisions appeared unanimous, objections had been noted, and all matters concluded with expressions of gratitude. Sister Agnes's name appeared only once, in connection with correspondence. The entry described her assistance as invaluable and her concerns as satisfactorily resolved. Purbright. Ht paused over the phrase. Resolution, he reflected, was a generous term. Mrs. Penfold returned with additional files and an apology for the delay. She explained that certain documents had been temporarily mislaid during reorganization. Purbright accepted this without comment. He asked instead about an unprinted newsletter draft referenced in the minutes. Oh yes, Mrs. Penfold said. A preliminary version. It seemed unnecessary. Unnecessary, Purbright repeated. It mentioned misunderstandings, she said, which had by then ceased to exist. Purbright leafed through the draft. It contained a brief paragraph referring to confusion over a legacy acknowledgement, now laid to rest through mutual goodwill. The paragraph was neatly struck through in pencil. The handwriting was Sister Agnes's. Later that afternoon, Purbright attended a meeting of the Mothers' Union, having been invited with an enthusiasm that bordered on obligation. Tea was served with precision. Conversation was industriously light. When Sister Agnes's name arose, it did so as an example of service rather than character. She never put herself forward, one woman said. Except when something needed correction, another added, then smiled quickly. Purbright listened, contributing nothing. He noticed how often the women referred to harmony, how rarely to truth. When he asked whether Sister Agnes had ever caused embarrassment, the question was met with thoughtful silence. Only unintentionally, someone said at last. From there he walked to the convent again, this time speaking with Sister Agnes's successor in correspondence, a young nun whose diligence exceeded her comfort. She described inheriting files that were exceptionally thorough, including several letters marked for follow-up. She wrote reminders, the nun said. Very gently. Were they acted upon? Purbright asked. The nun hesitated. Eve. Actually, Purbright asked whether any letters had gone unanswered. Yes, she said. A few. From people who preferred closure. As he left, he noticed the stack of envelopes again. One was missing. In the early evening, Purbright visited Mr. Caldwell once more, this time indoors. The organist produced a ledger, its pages worn at the edges. She insisted on accuracy, Caldwell said, even when it complicated generosity. He pointed to a marginal note beside a donation entry. The note corrected an attribution, assigning the gift to a different source. That correction was never made public, Caldwell said. Why not? Purbright asked. It was decided, Caldwell said carefully, that the truth might appear ungracious. Purbright returned to his lodgings as dusk settled over Merehurst. The town prepared for evening with a sense of accomplishment. He reviewed the day's findings, noting how often Sister Agnes had written in pencil. Pencil, he thought, implied both precision and erasure. Before retiring, he examined the copy of the choir book he had requested. Beneath the stand's measurements, faint indentations suggested writing once pressed there. He held the page to the light. The marks were unreadable, but their presence was unmistakable. Purbright closed the book gently. Somewhere in Merehurst, he suspected, someone still remembered exactly what had been written there, and was relieved that it no longer could be. Inspector Purbright began the day with a visit to the Municipal Records Office, a low building that smelled faintly of paste and reassurance. Merehurst preserved its history with care, preferring documents that confirmed continuity over those that suggested alteration. The clerk, a woman of middle years and moderate curiosity, produced ledgers with the calm pride of someone who trusted paper more than people. Purbright asked for records concerning charitable donat. Ions to the cathedral over the past decade. The request was met without resistance, though the clerk observed that such matters were usually handled internally. Purbright replied that internal arrangements were precisely his interest. She accepted this with a nod that suggested long familiarity with unproductive explanations. The ledgers were orderly, their columns aligned with almost moral intent. Names appeared repeatedly, some with increasing generosity, others with conspicuous regularity. Purbright noticed small discrepancies, amounts rounded up in public announcements, dates adjusted to coincide with festivals, attributions simplified. None of this was improper, strictly speaking. It was merely considerate. One entry caught his attention. A substantial donation was recorded under the name of a prominent family, accompanied by a marginal note initialed A.S. The note corrected the donor's identity, assigning the gift to a subsidiary trust. The correction had not been incorporated into subsequent summaries. Purbright thanked the clerk and left, carrying with him the agreeable weight of corroboration. Accuracy, he reflected, was not unwelcome in Merehurst. It was simply expected to remain discreet. Late in the morning he called on Mrs. Talbot again, under the pretext of clarifying publication procedures. She received him with professional warmth, though her hands betrayed a mild tension as she rearranged papers already in order. I was hoping, Purbright said, you might explain how corrections are decided upon. Mrs. Talbot smiled, with care, and occasionally declined, only when they risk misunderstanding. Purbright nodded. Misunderstanding can be useful. Mrs. Talbot's smile faltered, then recovered. She admitted that Sister Agnes had been persistent in matters of attribution. She believed the readers deserved clarity, Mrs. Talbot said. I believed I preferred comfort. And which prevailed? Mrs. Talbot looked down at her desk. We compromised. Purbright thanked her and left, noting that compromise had become a recurring theme. It suggested a town skilled in negotiation, less so in resolution. In the afternoon he visited the widow of a former benefactor, Mrs. Hargreaves, whose house overlooked the green with dignified confidence. She received him in a drawing-room arranged to discourage intimacy. Her manner was gracious, her speech deliberate. My husband supported the cathedral generously, she said. It mattered to him, and to the cathedral, Purbright added. Of course. He asked about the memorial plaque installed after her husband's death. Mrs. Hargreaves described it as tasteful, though she conceded that there had been some discussion regarding its wording. Sister Agnes felt the inscription overstated the sum, Mrs. Hargreaves said. She was quite correct. Yet the wording remained. Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. It seemed kinder. Purbright thanked her for her candor. As he rose to leave, she added, almost as an afterthought, she was very brave, that woman. Bravery is often inconvenient. The remark lingered with him as he walked back toward the close. He paused by the cathedral, watching a verge of polished brass that already shone. The act was repetitive, almost meditative. It suggested a preference for visible effort over substantive change. Inside, Purbright found the novice alone in the nave, arranging flowers with careful symmetry. She greeted him politely, though her eyes searched his face with something approaching expectation. "You are very thorough," she said. "I try not to be," Purbright replied. "Thoroughness can cause alarm." She hesitated, then spoke more quietly. Sister Agnes believed that names mattered because they were promises. "Promises to whom?" Purbright asked. "To everyone, aid. That is why they are difficult." He asked her whether she had seen the missing note. She shook her head, but her denial lacked conviction. "I was told," she said, "that it was better not to look." Purbright thanked her and left her to her flowers, which now appeared slightly less balanced. As evening approached, he returned to his lodgings and reviewed his notes. The pattern was now unmistakable. Sister Agnes had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. She had merely insisted on accuracy. In Merehurst, that insistence had been interpreted as a threat. He considered the missing note again. It was unlikely to contain anything dramatic. More probably it corrected a name, an amount, a sequence. Something small enough to be dismissed, yet precise enough to undermine a carefully maintained narrative. Before retiring, Purbright wrote a brief letter to the diocesan secretary, outlining his observations in cautious terms. He concluded that the matter was one of emphasis rather than misconduct. As he sealed the envelope, he wondered who, in Merehurst, had decided that emphasis was too dangerous to preserve. Outside, the cathedral bells marked the hour with practiced serenity. Purbright listened, thinking that harmony, when achieved at the expense of truth, tended to require constant rehearsal. He suspected that Sister Agnes had simply grown tired of repeating herself, and that the town had been relieved when she stopped. Inspector Purbright devoted the 6th day of his stay to correspondence, a pursuit he considered undervalued by those who preferred conclusions. Merehurst, when deprived of conversation, relied heavily on letters. They were written carefully, read selectively, and remembered imperfectly. He had asked for access to the convent's outgoing files, a request granted with the quiet resignation of people confident that nothing improper would be found. The files were arranged chronologically, each letter copied in a precise hand. Sister Agnes's influence was unmistakable. Her phrasing was courteous, her requests restrained, her reminders exact. She wrote to donors, to parish officials, to the diocese. She asked for confirmation, clarification, correction. Nowhere did she accuse, nowhere did she insist. The effect, Purbright observed, was cumulative rather than forceful. One letter, addressed to the diocesan treasurer, referred to a discrepancy between announced and received funds. The discrepancy was small, though not insignificant. The letter concluded with a suggestion that the matter might be resolved without public embarrassment. Purbright noted the phrase. It implied both consideration and expectation. The reply, when it came, was delayed and non-committal. The matter, it said, would be reviewed internally. No further correspondence followed. In the afternoon, Purbright attended a tea hosted by the Women's Fellowship, an event to which he had been invited with the careful enthusiasm reserved for visiting officials. The tea was served promptly. The conversation, equally prompt, avoided recent events with admirable coordination. Sister Agnes was mentioned only as an example of dedication. "She never complained," one woman said. "Not aloud," another added, then smiled quickly. Purbright asked whether Sister Agnes had ever expressed frustration. The question was met with thoughtful expressions and a collective pause. "She was patient," someone said at last. "Patience can look like disapproval." Purbright thanked them for their hospitality and withdrew, leaving behind an atmosphere of mild relief. Outside, he encountered Mr. Ellis, who was supervising the repositioning of a notice board. The board had been moved several inches to the left, an adjustment that appeared to satisfy no one entirely. "We thought it might be clearer, Mr. Ellis said. "Clarity," Purbright replied, "is a matter of perspective." Mr. Ellis nodded, though it was unclear whether he understood the remark or merely approved of its tone. He mentioned that the choir book had been inspected for damage and found to be intact. "And the note?" Purbright asked. Mr. Ellis smiled. "There was no note." Purbright did not challenge this. He had learned that denial, when offered with confidence, was rarely intended to convince. Later in the vestry he spoke with the assistant verger, a man of limited authority and considerable awareness. The verger explained that Sister Agnes had occasionally left messages for him, reminders about scheduling and maintenance. She liked things done properly, he said. Even small things, especially small things, Purbright said. The verger hesitated, then added, "She once asked me to move the choir book. Why?" She said something beneath it was being overlooked. Purbright thanked him and left, carrying the remark with him like a fragment of melody. Overlooked, he reflected, was a generous term. It suggested accident rather than intention. As evening approached, Purbright walked once more through the cathedral. The building was empty, its silence industrious rather than contemplative. He paused at the choir stalls, imagining the daily rituals, the careful placement of objects, the unspoken agreements. He bent slightly, examining the stand again. The faint impressions he had noticed earlier remained visible in the right light. He straightened, aware of someone behind him. The novice stood a short distance away, her hands folded with deliberate composure. "You are still looking," she said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "It seems appropriate." She nodded. "Sister Agnes used to say that what is hidden is often only hidden by agreement, and do you agree?" Purbright asked. She considered this. "I was told to," she said finally. Purbright thanked her for her honesty, which appeared to surprise her. She left without another word. That night in his lodgings, Purbright reviewed the day's notes. The pattern had grown clearer, though not more dramatic. Sister Agnes had pressed for accuracy in a community that preferred approximation. She had written politely, corrected gently, and persisted quietly. The town had responded with accommodation, delay, and eventual erasure. He considered the missing note again. It was unlikely to reveal anything new. Its significance lay not in its content, but in the effort expended to remove it. Someone had decided that even a penciled correction, left unread, posed a risk. Before sleeping, Purbright opened his notebook and wrote a single question, underlined once: "Who benefits from silence?" He closed the book and extinguished the light, aware that the answer, when it came, would probably be offered with impeccable courtesy. Inspector Purbright observed that Merehurst had entered what it considered the concluding phase of his visit. Politeness acquired a faint urgency, as though the town wished to escort him gently toward departure before curiosity hardened into something less manageable. Invitations diminished. Explanations shortened. People spoke as if matters were already settled, a tone that implied consensus rather than conclusion. He began the day with a return to the cathedral, arriving earlier than was customary and finding the building attended only by the verger and a cleaner whose progress suggested private reflection. The choir stalls were immaculate. The choir book rested on its stand with an air of restored innocence. Purbright stood for several minutes without touching anything, a practice that had become second nature. "There has been some concern," the verger said, appearing beside him with deliberate casualness, "that too much attention has been paid to that particular area." "Attention," Purbright replied, "is not a finite resource." The verger smiled obligingly. "Quite." Purbright asked whether any further documents had been discovered among Sister Agnes's effects. The verger said no, with a promptness that suggested the question had been anticipated. He added that the convent had been thorough in its review. "Thoroughness," Purbright said, "varies with purpose." The verger accepted this without response. From the cathedral, Purbright walked to the parish office, where Mrs. Penfold greeted him with a mixture of warmth and relief. She informed him that the council had held a brief meeting the previous evening and had agreed upon a final adjustment to certain records. "Adjustment," Purbright repeated. "A clarification," she amended. To prevent confusion, she produced a single sheet of paper, a revised acknowledgement of a legacy, now attributing the donation to a family trust rather than an individual benefactor. The change was minor, almost invisible. "And Sister Agnes would have approved?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Penfold hesitated. "She would have appreciated the accuracy," she said carefully. Though she might have preferred it sooner, Purbright thanked her and folded the paper without comment. Timing, he reflected, was often the most contentious aspect of truth. Later that morning he visited the retired schoolmaster, Mr. Linton, a man who attended evensong irregularly but read the parish newsletter with methodical interest. Linton had known Sister Agnes socially, in the limited sense that Merehurst allowed. "She had a precise mind," Linton said. "It made people uneasy." "Why?" Purbright asked. "Because precision invites comparison," Linton replied, "and comparison leads to ranking." Purbright asked whether Sister Agnes had ever confided in him. Linton considered this, she once remarked. That the town preferred gratitude to accuracy, he said. She said it kindly, as though describing the weather. In the afternoon, Purbright encountered Mr. Ellis again, this time supervising the replacement of a small plaque near the west door. The original had been removed for cleaning. "It will be returned shortly," Mr. Ellis said, "with minor corrections." "Corrections," Purbright said. "Are they noticeable?" "Only if one is looking." Purbright watched as the plaque was reinstalled. The lettering was identical, save for a single altered name, now rendered less specific. It was an improvement, aesthetically speaking. As evening approached, Purbright returned to the convent, where Sister Imelda received him with composed courtesy. He informed her that his report was nearly complete. "We are grateful," she said. "This has been a difficult time." "For whom?" Purbright asked. "For the community," she replied. "Uncertainty is unsettling." "And certainty?" Purbright asked. She smiled faintly. "Certainty can be divisive." He asked whether Sister Agnes had ever expressed regret. "Only," Sister Imelda said, "that clarity was so often mistaken for criticism." Before leaving, Purbright asked one final question. Did Sister Agnes believe the note would be found? Sister Imelda considered this. "I think," she said, "she believed it would be read." Outside, dusk gathered with orderly restraint. Purbright walked once more past the cathedral, pausing by the choir stalls. The novice was there again, straightening hymnals with habitual care. She glanced at him, then at the choir book. "They have moved it slightly," she said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "I noticed." She lowered her voice. "It used to rest more to the left. Does that matter?" She shrugged. "It covers something different now." Purbright thanked her and left the cathedral for the last time. As he crossed the close, he reflected that the town had achieved what it wanted: a correction without acknowledgement, accuracy without attribution. Sister Agnes's insistence had been absorbed, diluted, and rendered harmless. Yet, as he reached the gate, he looked back once more at the cathedral, its windows catching the last light. Beneath the choir book, whatever had been written was gone. What remained, he thought, was the question of who had moved it, and why that adjustment still seemed necessary. Inspector Purbright began the day with a sense that Merehurst was preparing to conclude its performance. The town had, over the previous week, demonstrated an admirable capacity for composure, and today that composure carried a faint edge of expectation. People he encountered greeted him politely, with smiles that implied careful rehearsal. Nothing was offered accidentally. Nothing was withheld without purpose. He returned to the cathedral at mid-morning, seeking clarity from the remaining choir members. They were already arranging hymnals, moving with quiet precision. Their attention shifted when he entered, a subtle acknowledgement of authority. He addressed them collectively, noting that their loyalty to Sister Agnes was evident, but their awareness of her corrections had been muted. One young chorister, more observant than her peers, lowered her gaze as she arranged the sheets. Purbright inferred that she had seen, or at least heard, more than she admitted. "The book," Purbright said, "is in its proper place, yes?" "Indeed," replied the senior chorister, a woman whose expression balanced diligence with restraint, "though occasionally the positioning requires attention." "And the messages?" Purbright asked. The chorister paused. "Some are no longer necessary," she said, "or they have been addressed indirectly." Her phrasing suggested both care and evasion. Purbright observed the subtle deflection. Accuracy, he reflected, had been absorbed into discretion. He moved to the vestry, where Mr. Henshaw, the verger, greeted him with habitual deference. They spoke briefly of choir logistics, of candles, of vestments. Purbright steered the conversation toward records. "Have all notes from Sister Agnes been accounted for?" he asked. "To my knowledge," Mr. Henshaw replied promptly. "Though some were misplaced temporarily." "Misplaced?" Purbright repeated, noting the hesitation. "Only briefly," the verger said, "and recovered quietly." Purbright made no further comment. The use of temporality as reassurance was a familiar tactic. He left the vestry and walked through the nave, noting the shadows of stained glass falling in orderly patterns. In that light, even the empty choir stalls seemed attentive. Later, he met with Mrs. Talbot, the parish newsletter editor. She was arranging papers on her desk with almost imperceptible anxiety. The final draft of the next issue, she said, was prepared to reflect current understanding. Purbright read the draft carefully. The section concerning Sister Agnes had been revised to note her attention to detail and devotion to truth, but it omitted any mention of corrections she had insisted upon. The omission was deliberate yet graceful. She was careful, Purbright said. "And others have been accommodating?" Mrs. Talbot smiled faintly. "Yes." "Politeness preserves confidence, even at the expense of clarity?" She hesitated. "Sometimes clarity is better held privately." The inspector noted the subtle emphasis. Merehurst had accommodated Sister Agnes's precision without allowing it to disturb the prevailing narrative. In the afternoon, Purbright visited the organist, Mr. Caldwell, who had agreed to a brief interview at home. Caldwell lived in a house that overlooked the cathedral's green, a vantage point that allowed him to observe without. "Being observed, I hear the choir is settled," Purbright began. "Yes," Caldwell replied. "Harmony is restored, externally at least, and internally." Caldwell paused, then smiled faintly. "Internal arrangements are delicate," Purbright asked about a ledger entry he had previously noticed. Caldwell confirmed that a marginal correction attributed a donation to a trust rather than an individual. "Was the correction widely known?" Purbright asked. "Not at all. It would have caused unnecessary debate," Caldwell said. "Sister Agnes understood this instinctively, yet she pressed the matter." Caldwell nodded, quietly, politely, and then she stopped. The inspector reflected on the phrase. To stop in Merehurst was often more disruptive than any action. As dusk approached, Purbright returned to the convent. He found the novice arranging hymnals once more, a gesture that had become almost ritualistic. She looked up briefly when he entered. "You are thorough," she said. "Perhaps too thorough for some." "Perhaps," Purbright replied. "Do you know where the note ended?" She hesitated. "Not entirely. I was told that it had been incorporated into other matters, meaning that its content has been acknowledged indirectly, without exposure." Her answer, careful and incomplete, confirmed what Purbright had suspected. The town had absorbed Sister Agnes's insistence, yet shielded itself from the implications. He nodded, accepting her discretion. Before leaving, he paused near the choir book. The light fell across its pages, catching the faint impression of what had once been written. He bent slightly, squinting. The indentations suggested the note had been precise, deliberate, and now deliberately hidden. As he stepped into the evening air, Purbright considered the day's observations. Accuracy had survived, partially, in silence and subtlety. The town had maintained its narrative while accommodating the truth in fragments. What remained unresolved was not the content of the note, but the question of who had decided it should vanish from sight, and why the absence still felt necessary. Purbright walked slowly toward his lodgings, noting how the windows of the cathedral glimmered with the final light. Harmony, he reflected, required both observation and omission. Somewhere within Merehurst, someone remembered exactly what had been written beneath the choir book, and that silent memory, he realized, might yet carry consequences, if only through its presence rather than its revelation. Inspector Purbright's 9th day in Merehurst began with a quiet reflection on observation. The town, having accommodated him for a week, had now settled into a rhythm of polite expectation. Individuals were careful with both words and gestures, as though every minor action risked altering the delicate balance of reputation and propriety. The inspector found that, in such a setting, the absence of confrontation revealed more than overt conflict ever could. He returned to the convent where the novice was already engaged in organizing hymnals, her movements precise and deliberate. She acknowledged his presence with a brief nod, and he noted the subtle tension in her posture. He asked her again about the note beneath the choir book. Her answer remained cautiously evasive. "I was instructed," she said quietly, "that it was better not to look directly." "Better not to look," Purbright repeated, allowing the phrase to linger. "Do you know why?" She shook her head. "Only that some things are safer when left unseen." The inspector inclined his head thoughtfully. Merehurst, he reflected, had mastered the art of managing truth. It could be acknowledged, corrected, or absorbed without ever being exposed publicly. Accuracy, when inconvenient, was frequently cloaked in discretion. After leaving the convent, he visited Mrs. Hargreaves, the widow of a former benefactor. She received him in the drawing-room, arranged with meticulous restraint. Tea was served precisely, and conversation proceeded along expected lines. Purbright inquired about the memorial plaque commemorating her late husband. There was discussion, she admitted, about wording that might exaggerate generosity. And the result? Adjusted quietly, Mrs. Hargreaves said. Sister Agnes suggested a correction, but it was implemented subtly, without announcement. Subtlety, Purbright observed, seems a preferred method here. Mrs. Hargreaves smiled faintly. Yes, the town prizes harmony, even over clarity, he asked. Sometimes, she said, though clarity is retained, quietly, for those who need it. Purbright thanked her and departed, walking slowly through the close. The streets were empty, save for the occasional cat observing him with disinterested caution. Notices for parish events remained in windows, but he noted their content was carefully neutral. The postponed recital had been rescheduled without drawing attention to the previous delay. Even the timing of church services appeared calculated to maintain composure. Later, he returned to the cathedral where Mr. Ellis, the church warden, was making final adjustments to a small plaque near the west door. The original had been removed temporarily for cleaning and minor corrections. It's restored, Mr. Ellis said, though altered slightly to reflect proper attribution. Proper attribution, Purbright repeated, inspecting the lettering. The change was minimal, almost imperceptible, yet enough to correct a subtle oversight. Was Sister Agnes aware? Purbright asked. Undoubtedly, Mr. Ellis replied. She would have approved of the accuracy, though perhaps not the delay. Purbright nodded, appreciating the nuance. Merehurst had restored factual correctness while preserving social equilibrium, a compromise both deliberate and understated. As the day waned, he returned to the parish office to consult Mrs. Penfold. The council had met briefly the previous evening, she explained, to finalize adjustments to several records. One sheet concerned a legacy acknowledgement, now attributing a donation to a trust rather than an individual. The revision was minor but precise. And Sister Agnes? Purbright asked. She would have appreciated the correction, Mrs. Penfold said, though she might have preferred it implemented sooner. Timing, he reflected, was often the most delicate aspect of truth in Merehurst. Later still, he revisited Mr. Caldwell, the retired organist, who provided a perspective both candid and guarded. She understood, Caldwell said, that exactitude could unsettle those unaccustomed to it, yet she pursued it anyway. Quietly? Purbright asked. Yes, always quietly. Until eventually, Caldwell paused. Until she stopped. Purbright considered the phrasing. To stop in Merehurst, he knew, was to provoke both relief and reflection. Sister Agnes's cessation of insistence had been absorbed as politely as her prior corrections. As evening fell, he returned to the convent for a final conversation with the novice. She was arranging hymnals once more, each movement deliberate, almost ritualistic. She looked at him and spoke softly. They have moved it slightly, she said, indicating the choir book. Yes, Purbright said. I noticed. She hesitated. It now covers something different. Different? Perhaps less visible, though still present, she said, a faint trace of apprehension in her tone. Purbright thanked her and left the cathedral, walking slowly across the close. The light had faded, and the windows of the cathedral gleamed with the last reflection of day. Harmony, he noted, had been maintained. Accuracy had survived in fragments, incorporated without exposure. Yet, as he reached the lodgings, he looked back once more. Beneath the choir book, whatever had been written was gone. The question remained who had moved it, and why did the adjustment still seem necessary? Purbright entered his room and reviewed his notes. The town had absorbed Sister Agnes's insistence with discretion, achieving correction without acknowledgement. Every participant had acted with civility, yet the memory of the note lingered, silent but potent. Somewhere in Merehurst, someone remembered exactly what had been written, and that memory, unspoken and precise, suggested that the story was not entirely concluded. Inspector Purbright rose with a measured sense of finality. Merehurst, he thought, had now shown him all it intended to, and he must reconcile observation with inference. The town's exterior remained immaculate. Its interior, however, was a delicate lattice of omission and accommodation. Accuracy had been preserved, but only in fragments. Civility had prevailed, though sometimes at the expense of visibility. He dressed with the precision of habit, knowing that appearances in Merehurst carried weight equal to fact. He began the day with a visit to the parish office. Mrs. Penfold greeted him with restrained warmth, as though anticipating closure. She presented the council's final records, each carefully annotated. Purbright examined them with deliberate attention. Corrections previously noted had been incorporated into summaries, yet always with discretion. Names were accurate, amounts properly attributed, but no commentary suggested that earlier oversights had existed. Accuracy, he observed, had been formalized into invisibility. "Every matter has been addressed," Mrs. Penfold said, "as fully as discretion allows." "Discretion," Purbright replied, "is often a more potent measure than force." She smiled faintly, seeming to approve of the phrasing. Later, he visited the convent for a last conversation with Sister Imelda. She received him in the parlor, hands folded, eyes calm. He inquired whether Sister Agnes had ever predicted the reception her corrections would receive. "She understood," Imelda said, "that precision can unsettle. Yet she pursued it regardless." "Quietly?" Purbright asked. "Always quietly." "And finally she ceased." Purbright nodded, reflecting on the careful suspension between assertion and surrender. To stop, in Merehurst, required more courage than most acts of direct confrontation. In the early afternoon he returned to the cathedral. The choir book rested on its stand, its pages unmarked by recent hands. He observed the faint indentations beneath the surface, proof of what had been written and erased. He glanced at the novice, who straightened hymnals with habitual care. "They adjusted it," she said softly. "Yes," Purbright replied. "I noticed. It covers something different now," she added, her voice low. "Different. Perhaps less visible, though not entirely gone," she said. Her careful phrasing implied that the town had made a deliberate decision to obscure rather than destroy. Purbright allowed a moment of silence, considering the implications. Accuracy had survived, yet discretion had absorbed it into the fabric of the community. Afterwards he visited Mr. Caldwell one final time. The retired organist regarded him with habitual sagacity. "Have you observed," Purbright asked, "how the town reconciles correction with continuity?" Caldwell nodded slowly. "They retain what matters to the conscience, omit what might discomfort the collective. Sister Agnes's insistence has been acknowledged without overt disclosure." "Silent acknowledgement," Purbright said, "is a curious form of respect." "Indeed," Caldwell agreed. "It is quieter than applause, yet often more enduring." As dusk settled, Purbright walked the close for the last time. The streets were empty, the windows glimmering with final reflections. Notices remained in place. The postponed recital had occurred without comment. Every detail suggested equilibrium, yet the faint impressions beneath the choir book whispered otherwise. He paused before the cathedral, observing the familiar shadows of the stained glass. Harmony, he noted, had been maintained. Accuracy had survived in fragments. Civility had preserved its narrative. Yet the memory of the note, though unread and unspoken, remained potent. The novice appeared briefly, pausing near the choir stalls. "Do you think it will ever be read?" Purbright asked. She considered this, her hands clasped tightly. "Perhaps," she said, "but only when someone is ready to see what was always there." Purbright inclined his head. That, he reflected, was the essence of Merehurst: resolution without revelation, understanding without exposure. Sister Agnes's insistence had been absorbed, the note removed from sight, yet its echo lingered in the careful adjustments, the faint indentations, the subtle hesitations of those who remembered. Before leaving, he bent slightly over the choir book, as if to acknowledge its silent testimony. The light caught the pages in a way that made the impressions more visible, though still unreadable. He straightened, sensing that the resolution of the town's moral and social economy was complete, but that the precise knowledge of one woman, inscribed quietly and then erased, had left its mark in ways that Merehurst could not entirely erase. Inspector Purbright turned toward the gate, his coat collar adjusted against the evening chill. The town had demonstrated its mastery of civility, accuracy, and discretion, yet he carried with him the subtle proof that truth, even partially obscured, possesses a persistence all its own. As he stepped beyond the close, he looked back once more. Beneath the choir book something remained, a question unspoken, an impression lingering, a reminder that even in the most orderly community certain matters refuse to vanish entirely.